Red and blue lights exploded across the rearview mirror, washing the quiet two-lane road in violent color. "Great," the old man muttered, easing his sedan onto the gravel shoulder. The engine clicked as it cooled. Cicadas buzzed in the trees. A church sign down the road read, "Sunday Service, 9 a.m., crooked letters missing an E. The driver, Harold Thompson, 71, kept both hands on the steering wheel like he'd been taught decades ago. 10 and 2. Slow breaths. Don't make sudden movements. The officer didn't take his time. The door of the patrol car slammed shut. Heavy boots crunched against gravel. A flashlight snapped on even though the sun hadn't fully set. "License and registration," a sharp voice barked before the officer even reached the window. Harold rolled it down halfway. "Yes, sir. They're in my wallet and glove box. I'll move slow." The officer leaned in, tall, broad, mirrored sunglasses still on despite the fading light. His name tag read Officer Brenner. "Don't narrate," Brenner snapped. "Just do it." Harold flinched, not visibly, but inside. He hadn't been spoken to like that in years, not since... He reached carefully for his wallet. Brenner's hand hovered near his holster. "Easy," Brenner warned. "Real easy." Harold's fingers trembled slightly as he pulled the worn leather wallet free. The edges were soft, cracked with age. It had been with him longer than most people in his life. He opened it. The officer's flashlight swept the interior of the car, the faded upholstery, the neatly folded grocery receipt, the church bulletin on the passenger seat. "Why'd you pull me over?" Harold asked quietly. "You were drifting, swerving." "I wasn't, sir," Harold replied. "I've been on this road 40 years. I know every—" "Are you arguing with me?" Brenner cut in. "No, sir, because it sounds like you are." Harold swallowed. "No, sir, just answering." Brenner snorted. "Uh-huh." He glanced back toward his cruiser, then leaned closer. "Step out of the vehicle." Harold blinked. "Sir?" "Out of the vehicle." "I'm 71 years old," Harold said calmly. "I've got arthritis in my knees. If you tell me why—" "Now!" The shout cracked through the quiet road like a gunshot. A passing car slowed, then sped up. Harold opened the door carefully and pushed himself upright. One hand braced against the frame. His knees protested. His breath came shallow. Brenner stepped back, hand firm on his belt. "Turn around." Harold complied. "Hands behind your back." That made him pause. "Officer, am I under arrest?" Brenner grabbed Harold's wrist and yanked his arms back. "You are if you don't stop talking." The cold metal of handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. Harold gasped, not from pain, but shock. "I haven't done anything," he said, voice cracking despite his effort to keep it steady. Brenner shoved Harold forward, pressing him against the hood of the car. "Spread your feet." Metal bit into Harold's palms as he leaned forward. The hood was still warm from the drive. "You fit the description," Brenner said casually. "Of what?" "Don't worry about it." A second patrol car pulled up. Another officer stepped out, younger, quieter. He watched, but didn't intervene. Brenner frisked Harold roughly, tugging at his jacket, patting his pockets harder than necessary. "What's in the wallet?" Harold said, "My ID, veteran card, insurance." "Veteran?" Brenner scoffed. "Sure." He yanked the wallet out of Harold's pocket and flipped it open. Cards spilled slightly, old photos, a yellowed slip of paper. Then Brenner stopped. Not fully, just a hesitation, a half-second. Harold felt it, even without turning around. Brenner pulled one item free. A small, heavy object slid into his palm. Metal clinked softly. "What's this?" Brenner asked, tone suddenly different. Harold closed his eyes. "The medal," he said quietly. "They keep it with me." Brenner turned it over. Bronze star, purple ribbon edge, engraved name worn but readable. The younger officer stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "Is that—" he began. Brenner cut him off with a sharp look. Harold spoke before either could stop him. "I was 19 when I landed overseas. Didn't even shave every day yet. They told us we were defending freedom. I believed them." Brenner's grip on the wallet tightened. "You saying this gets you out of something?" he snapped. "No, sir. I'm saying it explains why I don't lie." Silence stretched. The cicada seemed louder now. The younger officer cleared his throat. "Sarge, that's a real commendation."
Brenner didn't respond immediately. He stared at the metal, then at Harold, then at the passing car as slowing, drivers staring. Finally, he stepped back. "Take the cuffs off," he muttered. The younger officer hesitated. "Sir?" "I said take them off." The cuffs were removed. Harold rubbed his wrists, red marks blooming on thin skin. Brenner handed back the wallet, not meeting Harold's eyes. "You can go," he said curtly. "That's it?" Harold asked. Brenner's jaw tightened. "Drive safe." Harold stood there a moment longer, steadying himself. "Officer," he said gently. Brenner stiffened. "I carried that metal through jungle and fire, not to win arguments, just to remind myself who I am when the world forgets." Brenner said nothing. Harold got back into his car and drove away, hands shaking, not from fear anymore, but something heavier. In the patrol car, the younger officer finally spoke. "You didn't have to do that to him." Brenner stared straight ahead. "He fit the profile," he said flatly. "Or maybe," the younger officer replied, "we just didn't see the man before the skin." Brenner didn't answer, but long after the taillights disappeared, the image of that metal stayed burned into his mind. And by morning, the entire town would be talking about what happened on that quiet road, because someone had recorded it, and the truth was already spreading.
Harold Thompson didn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the red and blue lights again, flashing against the trees, bleeding into the dark. He felt the cold bite of the handcuffs, the humiliation of being pressed against his own car like a criminal on a road he'd driven his entire adult life. At 3:47 a.m., he finally gave up. He sat at the small kitchen table, the same one his late wife had refinished 30 years earlier, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he'd already forgotten to drink. The house creaked softly, settling around him. Old wood, old memories. On the table lay his wallet, open. The metal rested beside it. Harold stared at it for a long time. He hadn't meant for anyone to see it. He never did. He didn't wear it to parades, didn't bring it up in conversation. To him, it wasn't a badge. It was a reminder of boys who didn't come home, of promises made and broken. His phone buzzed, once, then again, then again. He frowned. No one called him this early. Finally, he picked it up. Unknown number. He answered cautiously. "Hello?" "Mr. Thompson?" a woman asked, voice brisk but controlled. "My name is Claire Hensley. I'm a reporter with Channel 7 News. I'm calling about an incident involving you and Officer Brenner last night." Harold's stomach dropped. "I don't," he began. "We have video," she said plainly. Silence filled the kitchen. "Video?" Harold repeated. "Yes, sir. A passing driver recorded the stop. It's already been uploaded online." Harold closed his eyes. "I didn't ask for that," he said quietly. "I understand," the reporter replied, "but people are watching, and they're asking questions." He rubbed his forehead, suddenly exhausted. "What kind of questions?" "About why a 71-year-old black veteran was handcuffed during a routine stop, about why the officer escalated, about why the conversation changed the moment your medal appeared." Harold exhaled slowly. "I just want to be left alone," he said. There was a pause on the other end. "Sir," she said more gently, "I don't think that's going to be possible anymore." Across town, Officer Brenner woke to chaos. His phone was vibrating non-stop on the nightstand, notifications stacked like unread warnings, missed calls from his sergeant, texts from numbers he didn't recognize. He squinted at the screen. One message stood out. "You're trending." He sat up sharply. "What the hell?" he muttered, opening the link. The video loaded slowly, too slowly. Then it played. There he was, standing over Harold, voice raised, posture aggressive. The audio was clear enough to hear the command, the snap in his tone. The moment Harold asked why he was being pulled over, the cuffs, the shove, and then the pause. The moment Brenner opened the wallet,
the shift everyone could see, but he hadn't noticed at the time. The comments were already pouring in. Disgusting. That man deserved respect. This is what profiling looks like. He served this country. You harassed him. Brenner slammed the phone down. Out of context, he growled to no one. They don't know the whole story. But the video kept playing in his head anyway. By 8 a.m., the department was buzzing. Officers clustered in low voices. Screens in the break room replayed the clip on loop, news anchors dissecting every frame. And what many viewers are calling a disturbing example of racial profiling. The medal appears to change the officer's demeanor. Community leaders are demanding answers. Sergeant Wallace stood at the front of the room, arms crossed, jaw set. Phones away. Everyone listen. The room quieted. We are aware of the videos circulating online. Internal review is underway. Until further notice, Officer Brenner is placed on administrative leave. A murmur rippled through the room. Brenner felt heat crawl up his neck. This is bullshit, he muttered under his breath. Wallace's eyes snapped at him. You want to say that louder, Brenner? No, sir. Good, because right now you say nothing to anyone. Media, family, friends, you say nothing. Brenner clenched his fists. Yes, sir. Meanwhile, the town of Millbrook was waking up, and it was angry. The local diner buzzed louder than usual. Coffee cups slammed down harder. People leaned in over booths, phones out, replaying the clip again and again. You see this? One man said, shaking his head. That could have been my dad. That officer had no right. None, a woman snapped. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd began to gather by midday. Veterans in old jackets, church members, high school kids holding signs they'd made that morning. Respect our elders. Justice isn't selective. Service should mean something. Harold watched it all unfold from his living room. The television murmured constantly. His phone rang so often he finally turned it off. He didn't recognize himself on the screen. He looked smaller there, frailer. But his voice, when the clip caught it, was steady. I don't lie. That part kept replaying. A knock sounded at the door. Harold stiffened. He wasn't expecting anyone. He rose slowly, joints aching, and opened it. Two men stood on his porch. One wore a suit, the other a windbreaker with a familiar emblem. Mr. Thompson? The man in the jacket asked. I'm with Internal Affairs. Harold nodded once. I figured, he said. Come in. They sat at the same kitchen table, the same medal between them. We're conducting a formal inquiry, the suited man began. We'd like to hear your account. Harold looked at them calmly. You already saw it. The video doesn't lie. We still need your statement. Harold nodded. And then, for the first time, he told the whole story. About the stop, the tone, the fear that crept in despite decades of discipline. About how old memories have a way of waking up without permission. I've been called worse than boy, he said quietly. I've had guns pointed at me overseas and right here at home. But it's the respect that wears you down, makes you feel invisible. The IA officer scribbled notes. You didn't resist, he observed. No, because I knew if I did, I might not be sitting here today. The room went still. That afternoon, the reporter called again. Mr. Thompson, would you be willing to speak on camera? Harold hesitated. I'm not looking for trouble, he replied. I know, but sometimes truth makes trouble whether we want it to or not. Harold looked at the medal again, at the photograph of his younger self tucked behind it, at the eyes that had once believed this country would always recognize its own. All right, he said finally, but I won't shout, I won't insult, I'll just tell the truth. By evening, the interview aired. Harold sat straight-backed in his chair, voice calm, eyes clear. I don't hate the officer, he said on camera. I hate the moment. I hate that respect came only after proof, that my service had to be shown before my humanity was believed. The anchor thanked him. The screen faded. Outside, protesters lit candles. Inside police headquarters, Officer Brenner sat alone in his car, watching the clip on his phone, over and over. For the first time, doubt crept in, and it didn't leave.
The metal felt heavier than Harold remembered. He sat alone at the small dining table, the house quiet except for the ticking clock above the sink. Evening light filtered through lace curtains his wife had hung decades earlier. The same curtains, the same table, the same man, older now, slower, but still carrying the same memories he never talked about. The metal rested in his palm, its dull gold surface catching the light. He turned it over with his thumb, tracing the worn engraving like a habit he'd never quite broken. Bronze star. He hadn't asked for it, never thought much of it either. Back then, medals weren't about pride, they were about survival. Lisa sat across from him, watching quietly. She had learned long ago that when her father grew silent like this, words only got in the way. "You don't have to hold it," she said gently. Harold shook his head. "I do tonight." He leaned back in his chair, eyes unfocused, drifting somewhere far beyond the walls of the house. "I was 21, he began. Didn't know a thing about the world. Lisa listened. "They sent us over in '73, jungle heat, mud everywhere. You never felt clean. You never slept deep." His voice stayed calm, but his hands tightened slightly around the metal. "There was a boy in my unit, white kid from Iowa. Couldn't have been more than 19. Reminded me of my younger brother." Harold swallowed. "We were pinned down one night, took fire from both sides. He froze, couldn't move." Lisa leaned forward. "I didn't think, I just ran." Harold gave a faint, humorless smile. "That's the thing they never tell you. Courage doesn't feel brave, it feels stupid." He paused. "I dragged him out, took a hit in the leg, didn't notice until later." "That's why they gave you the medal," Lisa said softly. "That's why they said they gave it to me." Harold looked down. "But the truth is, I just didn't want to watch another kid die." Silence settled between them. Outside, a distant siren wailed and faded. Harold folded the medal back into his wallet, the same worn leather that had been slapped open on the side of the road the day before. "That officer didn't see any of that," he said quietly. "He saw an old black man driving a little too slow." Lisa's jaw tightened. "And that's the problem." The next morning the doorbell rang again. Harold sighed. "If that's another reporter—" "It's not," Lisa said, peering through the window. "It's a young man in uniform." Harold stood slowly, joints protesting, and opened the door. A young army private stood on the porch, cap tucked under his arm. He looked nervous, too clean, too young. "Mr. Thompson?" the soldier asked. "Yes." The young man swallowed. "Sir, I saw the video. I just wanted to say thank you." Harold blinked. "For your service," the private continued. "My grandfather was in Vietnam too. He didn't come back the same. He never talked about it." Harold studied the boy's face, seeing echoes of men he'd buried and men he'd tried to forget. "Come in," Harold said. They sat in the living room. The soldier spoke about training, about fear, about how the video had shaken him. "I thought things were different now," the boy admitted. Harold nodded slowly. "Some things are, some things aren't. That's why you have to be better than we were." The soldier stood to leave, eyes bright. "I hope I make you proud one day, sir." "You already do," Harold said. After the door closed, Harold sat quietly for a long time. That afternoon, the city council announced a public hearing. Officer Brenner would be required to testify. So would Harold. Lisa read the notice aloud, her voice tight. "You don't have to do this." Harold looked at the medal again. "I didn't speak up then. I'm not staying quiet now."
Across town, Brenner sat in his car outside the precinct, hands gripping the steering wheel. He hadn't gone inside yet. He watched a group of protesters across the street, veterans mixed with families, older men in faded caps bearing unit patches. One man held a sign that read, "I served too." Brenner felt something twist in his gut. He replayed the stop again and again in his mind, the suspicion, the assumptions, the way his heart rate spiked for no reason he could name. His phone buzzed, a message from his father. "Saw the video, we need to talk." That night, Brenner sat across from his father at the kitchen table he'd grown up eating at. The old man's hair was gray now, his posture stiff. "You embarrassed yourself," his father said, bluntly. Brenner bristled. "I followed procedure." His father shook his head. "No, you followed fear." Silence. "I wore a badge for 30 years, and I learned something the hard way. Authority doesn't make you right, it just gives you the power to be wrong louder." Brenner stared at the table. "I saw that medal," his father said. "That man earned it." "So did others," Brenner muttered. "Yes," his father said, "but you didn't see them. You saw a threat." The words landed heavy. The night before the hearing, Harold polished his shoes, slowly, carefully, the same shoes he'd worn to his wife's funeral, the same ones he wore to church every Sunday. Lisa watched from the doorway. "You're nervous," she said. Harold smiled faintly. "I've been nervous before." He buttoned his jacket, slipping the wallet into the inside pocket. Not to prove anything, just to remember who he was. The hearing room was packed the next morning. Cameras lined the walls. Reporters whispered. Harold took his seat at the long table, back straight, hands folded. Across from him, Officer Brenner sat rigid, eyes forward. The console chair cleared her throat. "Mr. Thompson, thank you for being here." Harold nodded. "Please," she said, "tell us who you are." Harold took a breath. "My name is Harold James Thompson. I'm a retired machinist, a father, a grandfather, and a veteran of the United States Army." The room went still. "And yesterday," he continued, "I was reminded that even after everything I've given to this country, I still have to prove I belong." He paused. "But I'm not here for revenge. I'm here so the next man doesn't have to carry his service in his wallet like a shield." Across the room, Brenner lowered his gaze. The medal wasn't just metal anymore. It was a mirror, and for the first time, the country was being forced to look into it.
The room smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of place where decisions were made slowly, but their consequences lasted a lifetime. Harold sat upright at the long table, hands folded neatly, jacket pressed, shoes shining under fluorescent lights. He looked smaller than he had on the roadside, less like a suspect and more like what he was, a man who had lived long enough to know when silence had done more harm than noise. Across from him, Officer Brent Brenner sat stiff-backed, uniform crisp, jaw set. His badge caught the light every time he shifted, a small glint of authority that suddenly felt heavier than before. The council chairwoman adjusted her glasses and tapped the microphone. "This hearing is now in session." The low murmur in the gallery quieted. Cameras blinked to life. Somewhere in the back, a woman cleared her throat, then went still. "Officer Brenner," the chairwoman said, "you will have an opportunity to speak, but first we will hear from Mr. Thompson." Harold nodded once and leaned forward slightly. "I'm not here to attack anyone," he began. His voice was steady, calm, not rehearsed but practiced by years of restraint. "I'm here because what happened to me happens to a lot of people. It just doesn't usually get filmed." A ripple passed through the room. "I was pulled over for a broken taillight. That's what I was told. But before I could ask a question, I was ordered out of my car. My hands were shaking, not because I was guilty, but because I've lived long enough to know how quickly a situation can turn." He paused, eyes blinking briefly toward Brenner, then back to the council. "When I reached for my wallet, I wasn't thinking about a medal.
I was thinking about survival." A few heads in the gallery bowed. "I showed that medal not to prove I was better than anyone else, but because I hoped it would remind the officer that I am someone." He sat back. "I shouldn't need proof to be treated like a human being." The chairwoman nodded slowly. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson." She turned. "Officer Brenner?" Brenner stood, his chair scraping softly against the floor. He cleared his throat once, twice. "I followed departmental protocol," he said. "The area has seen increased thefts. The driver appeared nervous." Harold's daughter, Lisa, shifted in her seat. "Nervous," the chairwoman repeated. "Yes, ma'am." "Officer," she said evenly, "do you believe nervousness is a crime?" Brenner hesitated. "No." "Then why was Mr. Thompson ordered out of his vehicle before any explanation was given?" Brenner's mouth opened, then closed. "I assessed a potential risk." The chairwoman leaned forward. "Based on what?" Brenner swallowed. "His movements." "Which movements?" she pressed. He reached toward his wallet. The room went still. "A wallet," she repeated. "Yes. And what did you believe was in that wallet, Officer Brenner?" Brenner's face flushed. "I didn't know." "That's the point, isn't it?" the chairwoman said quietly. "You assumed." Brenner stiffened. "I made a judgment call." "And was that judgment influenced by Mr. Thompson's race?" A murmur rippled through the gallery. Brenner's eyes blinked briefly toward his father, seated behind him, then back. "No, ma'am." The chairwoman didn't argue. She simply nodded and gestured toward the screen. "Let's review the footage." The video played again. The stop, the commands, the tension rising with every second. This time, no one looked away. When the medal appeared, the room reacted as one, a sharp intake of breath, a collective shift in posture. The video ended. The chairwoman turned back to Brenner. "Officer, when you saw the medal, your tone changed immediately." "Yes." "Why?" Brenner hesitated. "Because I recognized his service." "And before that moment?" "I didn't know." Harold spoke then, voice quiet but firm. "You didn't ask." Brenner turned toward him, startled. "You didn't ask who I was. You decided first." Silence. The chairwoman folded her hands. "Officer Brenner, do you believe service to this country is worthy of respect?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then why did Mr. Thompson only receive that respect after proving it?" Brenner's shoulders sagged slightly. "I don't have a good answer." For the first time, the room felt something shift. Not absolution, not forgiveness, but honesty cracking through defense. The chairwoman nodded. "That answer matters." A council member cleared his throat. "Mr. Thompson, may I ask you something?" "Of course." "If you had not carried that medal, what do you believe would have happened?" Harold didn't answer right away. "I don't know," he said finally, "and that uncertainty is the problem." The council member nodded slowly. A woman in the gallery stood suddenly. "My husband was a veteran. He never made it home from his last stop." The chairwoman raised her hand gently. "Ma'am?" The woman continued, tears spilling. "I just want to say, thank you for speaking up." Harold inclined his head respectfully. The hearing stretched on. Policy questions, procedural reviews, expert testimony, but the heart of it remained unchanged. A man had been judged before he was known. When the session recessed, Brenner remained standing as Harold rose slowly. For a moment, neither moved. Then Brenner spoke, low enough that only Harold could hear. "I'm sorry. Not because of the video, because of the man I was before it." Harold studied him, not as an officer, not as an enemy, but as someone standing at a crossroads. "Do better tomorrow. That's all apologies are worth." Brenner nodded once. Outside, cameras flashed as Harold exited the building. Reporters shouted questions. Microphones crowded in. Harold raised a hand gently. "I've said what I needed to say. Now it's time to listen." As he walked away, Lisa slipped her arm through his. "You okay?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "I think so." Behind them, the building loomed, unchanged, unmoved. But inside, something had cracked, and cracks, Harold knew, were where light eventually got in.
The consequences did not arrive with sirens or shouting. They arrived quietly, the way real change often does, through paperwork, closed-door meetings, and uncomfortable pauses where certainty used to live. Officer Brent Brenner sat alone in the locker room long after his shift had officially ended. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale sheen across rows of metal lockers scarred by decades of service. His uniform hung untouched on the hook beside him. For the first time since joining the force, he wasn't sure if he would wear it again tomorrow. His phone buzzed on the bench. A message from Internal Affairs. Administrative leave effective immediately, pending review. He read it twice. Across town, Harold Thompson stood at his kitchen sink, watching water run over a chipped ceramic mug he'd owned since the 80s. The house was quiet, except for the ticking clock on the wall, the same one he'd fixed after returning from overseas, when silence felt louder than gunfire. Lisa sat at the table, laptop open, scrolling through headlines. "Dad," she said softly, "it's everywhere." He didn't ask what it was, he already knew. Videos clipped and reposted, talking heads debating tone instead of truth, comment sections split clean down old familiar lines. One headline read, "Traffic stop turns national debate after veteran identified." Another, "Officer suspended following controversial stop." Harold dried the mug slowly, deliberately. "They always need a headline," he said. Lisa nodded. "But people are listening this time." He glanced at the screen. "Some are." At the police precinct, the mood had shifted. Conversations dropped when certain officers walked into a room. Others spoke too loudly, overcompensating. The usual jokes at roll call felt forced, brittle. Captain Elaine Foster stood at the front of the briefing room, hands clasped behind her back. "We will not discuss the ongoing investigation," she said evenly. "But understand this, our duty is not just to enforce the law, it is to earn trust." No one spoke. "Authority without restraint," she continued, "is not strength, it's liability." That word hung in the air longer than she intended. Liability. Back at home, Brenner's father sat at the dining table, newspaper folded but unread. "You want coffee?" Brenner asked. His father shook his head. "I want to understand." Brenner swallowed. "I messed up." "You followed training," his father said slowly. "I followed fear." The words surprised even him. His father leaned back, studying the son he thought he knew. Fear of what? Brenner didn't answer, because the truth didn't fit cleanly into the stories he'd grown up hearing. That afternoon, Harold received a letter, handwritten, careful script. It was from a man in Ohio, another veteran. "I never carried my medals either," it read. "Didn't think they'd matter. Turns out they do, sometimes too late." Harold folded the letter and placed it in a drawer already thick with quiet testimonies. People had started reaching out. Veterans, teachers, retired officers. Some thanked him. Some apologized. Some asked questions they'd never dared ask themselves. That evening, Lisa saw her father sit on the porch, staring out at the darkening street. "You didn't ask for this," she said gently. "No," replied Harold, "but maybe I was meant to stand where I did." She hesitated. "Do you ever wish you hadn't reached for that wallet?" He considered it. "No," he said. "I wish I hadn't needed to." 2 days later, the department announced mandatory bias and de-escalation training. Not a press stunt, not a promise, but a line item with dates attached. Some officers welcomed it. Others bristled. One muttered, "Been doing this 30 years, never needed a class to tell me right from wrong." Another replied quietly, "Maybe that's the problem." At a town hall meeting that week, Harold was invited to speak. He almost declined. He didn't want to be a symbol.
He wanted to be a man allowed to live quietly. But he stood anyway. "I didn't come here angry," he told the crowd. "I came tired." A ripple of understanding moved through the room. Tired of having to prove I belong. Tired of being told it's not personal when it always feels that way. He paused. "I believe in accountability because I believe in redemption, but redemption doesn't start with denial." The applause was polite at first, then grew. Not thunderous, not performative. Honest. Meanwhile, Brenner sat at home watching the broadcast alone. He listened to every word, and for the first time he didn't feel accused, he felt exposed. That night he opened his training manual, the one he hadn't looked at in years, and read sections he'd once skimmed past. Implicit bias, escalation cues, decision fatigue. He realized how often he'd relied on instinct without questioning where it came from. Across the city, an internal review board reached its conclusion. The findings were clear. No criminal wrongdoing, but significant procedural violations, conduct unbecoming, failure to de-escalate. The punishment wasn't dramatic: suspension without pay, mandatory retraining, probationary return contingent on performance review. Some called it too lenient, others called it career-ending. Brenner read the notice in silence, then folded it carefully. Harold learned of the decision through a reporter's voicemail. He listened once, then deleted it. Lisa looked at him. "You okay with that?" Harold nodded. "Justice doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like interruption." That weekend, Harold visited the Veterans Hall downtown. The walls were lined with photographs, men and women frozen in youth, courage etched into grainy frames. He paused at one image of a young black soldier standing at attention, eyes steady. "Never thought I'd be back here," he murmured. An old friend clapped him on the shoulder. "World's catching up to you, Harold." "World's slow, but it moves." Outside, the sun dipped low, painting the street in gold. A patrol car passed by. The officer inside slowed, rolled down the window. "Afternoon, sir," he said respectfully. Harold nodded back. A small thing, but small things, he knew, were where change lived. As night fell, Harold placed the medal back in his wallet, not because he felt safer, but because he wanted to remember. Not what it had stopped, but what it had started.
The reckoning didn't come with shouting or flashing lights. It arrived in moments that forced people to sit with themselves. Officer Brent Brenner stood in the parking lot outside the precinct, keys dangling uselessly in his hand. His suspension badge lay locked inside, inaccessible for the first time since he'd earned it. The building looked the same: brick, glass, flag fluttering above, but he no longer felt like it belonged to him. A younger officer passed by, nodded politely, then hesitated. "Sir," he said, "I watched the hearing." Brenner turned. "I didn't think I was doing anything wrong," the young man added quietly, "until I saw it." Brenner exhaled slowly. "That makes two of us." The officer nodded again and walked on, leaving Brenner alone with the uncomfortable realization that influence didn't end when authority paused. Sometimes it sharpened. Across town, Harold Thompson sat at his dining table, reading through a stack of handwritten letters. He didn't open them quickly. He treated each one like a conversation, taking the time to listen before responding, even if the response was silence. One letter stood out. No return address. "I was taught to fear men like you," it read. "That's on me. I'm trying to unlearn it." Harold folded it carefully. Unlearning, he thought, was harder than learning. It required admitting something had been wrong all along. Lisa watched him from the doorway. "You don't have to answer every one." "I know," he said, "but some people don't need answers. They need acknowledgement." At a mandatory departmental seminar, officers filled a lecture hall usually reserved for commendations and retirement speeches.
The mood was different, subdued, wary. The facilitator, a retired captain with decades behind him, stood at the front. "This isn't about shaming," he said. "It's about recognition." He paused. "The most dangerous words in policing are, 'I've always done it this way.'" A murmur rippled through the room. Brenner sat in the back, arms crossed, listening. When instinct overrides training, you're not being decisive, you're being careless. Brenner felt the words land, not like an attack, but like a mirror. That evening, Brenner drove past the street where he'd stopped Harold. He hadn't meant to. His hands had just turned the wheel without thinking. The spot looked ordinary, a faded stop sign, a patch of uneven pavement, a streetlight flickering to life. No marker, no plaque, no sign of the tension that had once filled the air. He parked and sat there longer than he meant to. Across the city, Harold attended a small church meeting, not to speak, not to lead, but to listen. The pastor mentioned reconciliation. Harold leaned back, arms folded. Reconciliation, he knew, wasn't the same as forgetting. It was remembering differently. Afterward, a woman approached him, hesitant. "My grandson wants to be a police officer. I don't know what to tell him anymore." Harold smiled gently. "Tell him the badge should make him gentler, not harder." She nodded, eyes moist. "Thank you." The next morning, Brenner received an email. Request for voluntary mediation session, Community Relations Office. He stared at it for a long moment. Voluntary. He clicked accept. The mediation room was small, neutral, beige walls, 2 chairs facing each other, a third off to the side. Harold arrived first, posture calm, eyes attentive. When Brenner entered, he stopped short. Neither man spoke. The mediator cleared her throat. "Thank you both for agreeing to be here." She gestured gently. "This isn't about resolution. It's about understanding." Brenner sat slowly. "I've replayed that stop 100 times, trying to find the moment where I could have done something different." Harold nodded. "Did you find it?" "Yes," Brenner said, "and it scares me how early it was." Silence settled. "I didn't see you, not really. I saw a possibility." Harold studied him. "We're all possibilities when someone's afraid." Brenner swallowed. "I didn't know how much I was carrying until it spilled onto you." Harold leaned back slightly. "What you carry is yours. What you do with it affects others." The mediator nodded, scribbling notes. "I won't ask you to forgive me," Brenner said. "I don't think that's fair." Harold considered him. "Forgiveness isn't a favor, it's a process, and it's not always the point." Brenner looked up. "Then what is?" "Change," Harold replied simply. When the session ended, neither man shook hands. They didn't need to. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Brenner watched Harold walk away. Not triumphant, not bitter, just steady. At home that night, Brenner opened a box in his closet. Old commendations, photos, newspaper clippings. He removed a plaque reading Officer of the Month and placed it face down. Not in shame, in reconsideration. Harold, meanwhile, sat at his desk and finally responded to one letter. "Do better tomorrow. That's how reckoning becomes repair." He sealed the envelope and set it aside. The reckoning wasn't over, but it had begun doing its quiet work, inside rooms without cameras, inside conversations without applause, inside men learning that power without humility was just another kind of weakness. And in that understanding, something fragile and necessary was taking root. The turning point didn't arrive with a headline. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, quietly, when Officer Brent Brenner stood in front of his bathroom mirror and did something he hadn't done in 27 years of service. He hesitated. The uniform hung on the back of the door, pressed, familiar, heavy with memory. For decades, putting it on had been automatic, muscle memory, identity. Now, it felt like a question. He reached for the shirt, stopped, and sat on the edge of the bed instead. Outside, dawn crept across the neighborhood. A dog barked. Somewhere, a lawn sprinkler ticked on. Life continued, indifferent to his uncertainty. At the precinct, changes were underway. Not loud ones, not the kind that drew cameras, but they were real. Body cam policies were being reviewed, traffic stop protocols rewritten, community ride-alongs scheduled with officers who had never volunteered before. Some welcomed it. Others muttered. In the break room, a conversation stalled when Brenner walked in. A few officers nodded, a few didn't. One spoke up. "Guess we're all suspects now." Brenner poured coffee slowly. "No," he said, "we're all accountable." That word hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Across town, Harold Thompson was volunteering at the local Veterans Center, not as a speaker, not as a symbol, but as a man who knew how to listen. A younger vet sat across from him, tapping his knee nervously. "They keep telling me to let it go," the man said, "but they don't tell me how." Harold nodded. "That's because letting go isn't something someone gives you instructions for. It's something you circle for a while." The man looked up. "How long did it take you?" Harold smiled faintly. "I'll let you know when I'm done." Later that afternoon, Harold received an unexpected call. It was from the police academy. They wanted him to speak, not about the incident, not about the medal, about judgment. "I'm not an expert," Harold said. "That's exactly why we want you," the coordinator replied. The academy auditorium was filled with recruits, fresh uniforms, stiff posture, eager eyes. Harold stood at the podium, hands resting lightly on the wood. "I was pulled over by a man who thought he knew me. He didn't, and for a few minutes neither did I." The room was silent. "I remembered who I was when I reached for my wallet, but I realized something, later, I shouldn't have had to." He paused. "Your badge doesn't give you vision, it gives you responsibility. If you don't look carefully, you'll miss the human being standing in front of you." In the back row, Brenner listened, not as an officer, as a man. That night, Brenner drove to the edge of the city, to a small diner that had been there longer than the precinct itself. He ordered coffee, black, and a slice of pie he barely touched. A woman at the counter recognized him. "You're that officer from the video," she said. He braced. "My husband was a cop. Good man, but he carried too much home with him." Brenner nodded slowly. "I think I did too." She slid the sugar closer. "Maybe it's not about what you did. Maybe it's about what you do next." The next day, Brenner requested reassignment, not out of punishment, out of purpose. He asked to work with training, mentoring new officers, reviewing stops, walking neighborhoods without sirens. The chief raised an eyebrow. "That's not a step up." Brenner met his gaze. "It's a step forward." Word spread. Some scoffed, some watched. Harold noticed the change before he believed it. When Brenner attended a community forum, not in uniform, not behind a podium, Harold saw something unfamiliar in him. Stillness. Brenner didn't speak at first. He listened. To a mother who feared her son wouldn't come home. To a shop owner tired of suspicion. To an elderly man who said, "I remember when cops waved instead of stared." When Brenner finally spoke, it wasn't rehearsed. "I can't undo what I did, but I can stop pretending it was nothing." No applause followed, just nods, which felt heavier. Weeks passed. The department released its findings: disciplinary action, mandatory retraining, policy revisions. But the real turning point wasn't on paper. It was in a classroom where Brenner stood before recruits and said, "Instinct is not an excuse, fear is not authority, and respect isn't demanded, it's earned." Harold attended one session quietly, sitting in the back. Afterwards, Brenner approached him. I won't ask if this makes things right, Harold said. He studied him. Does it make them better? I think it can, Brenner replied. Harold extended his hand. Brenner hesitated, then shook it. Not firmly, not triumphantly, but honestly. Outside, a group of recruits watched, unsure why the moment mattered. They'd understand later. The turning point wasn't redemption, it wasn't forgiveness, it was responsibility choosing to stay, even when walking away would have been easier. And in that choice, something began to shift, not just between two men, but in the quiet space where power meets humility and decides, finally, to listen.
The final reckoning did not arrive with sirens. It came with paperwork. Harold Thompson sat at his kitchen table, the same one his late wife had refinished 30 years earlier, sunlight slanting through lace curtains onto a stack of envelopes he hadn't opened yet. His hands rested flat on the wood, steady, patient, hands that had once held a rifle in foreign sand, and later a steering wheel during graveyard shifts, and now letters that carried the weight of a moment he never asked for. At the top of the pile was one envelope heavier than the rest. Official, cream-colored, embossed seal. He opened it slowly. Inside was the department's final determination. Findings confirmed. Policies violated. Corrective actions enforced. No dramatic language, no excuses, just facts. Harold read it once, then again. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only something quieter. Closure. Across town, Officer Brent Brenner stood in an empty precinct hallway long after his shift had ended. His locker door hung open. Inside, his badge lay on the shelf. Not surrendered, not revoked, but removed for reassignment. He ran his thumb over the number engraved on the metal. For years, that badge had been armor. Now it felt like a mirror. The chief had been clear. "You're staying, but not the same way." Brenner nodded. "I don't want to be." She studied him. "You understand this doesn't end when the cameras go away." "I know. That's why I'm still here." At the Veterans Center, Harold spoke one last time, not to reporters, not to recruits, but to a room full of men and women who had lived long enough to recognize when history bent without breaking. "I didn't win anything," Harold said. "I stood still. The truth did the walking." A woman raised her hand. "Do you forgive him?" Harold considered the question carefully. Forgiveness is personal. Accountability is public. We don't confuse the two. That night, the city council chamber filled quietly. No protests, no chants, no spectacle. Just citizens, old couples, young families, veterans in worn caps, waiting to witness something rare. The chief stepped forward. She spoke plainly, acknowledged harm, outlined reform, committed to oversight. Then she turned. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "would you care to say anything?" Harold stood. He did not approach the microphone right away. When he did, he rested both hands on the podium, grounding himself. "I was raised to believe that respect is shown, not demanded, and authority exists to protect, not to intimidate." He looked around the room. "I don't want revenge. I don't want apologies whispered and forgotten. I want us to remember that dignity isn't conditional." Silence followed. Then a single clap. Then another. They did not swell into thunder. They didn't need to. Later, Brenner waited outside, not in uniform, not hiding. When Harold emerged, the two men stood facing each other under a streetlight that flickered faintly. "I won't pretend this fixes everything," Brenner said. Harold nodded. "It doesn't." "But it fixes something," Brenner added. "It starts something," Harold corrected. Brenner exhaled slowly. "I'll carry this. You should. So should I." They shook hands once more. Not as adversaries,
not as symbols, as men who had reached the end of something and the beginning of something else. Weeks later, the dashcam footage stopped circulating, but its echo remained. In classrooms, in training manuals, in conversations parents had with their children. The medal returned to Harold's wallet, not because it needed to be hidden again, but because it had never been the point. One afternoon, Harold drove the same stretch of road where it had all begun. Same trees, same bend, same faded lines. He pulled over. Just once. He sat there, engine idling, listening to the wind move through the leaves. Then he drove on. At the precinct, a new recruit asked Brenner a question during training. What do you do when your instincts tell you one thing, but your conscience tells you another? Brenner didn't answer right away. Listen to the conscience. Instincts can be trained. Character has to be chosen. On a quiet Sunday morning, Harold stood at his church, shaking hands. An older man leaned in. You handled yourself well. Harold smiled gently. I handled myself honestly. That was enough. The story faded from the news cycle. Another headline took its place. But in living rooms and barber shops, among people who had lived long enough to know better, the story lingered. Not because of outrage, because of recognition. Because sometimes the most powerful reckoning isn't loud. It's when a man looks at himself and decides to do better. And that day, on an ordinary road with an ordinary traffic stop, America had been reminded of something it too often forgets. Respect isn't granted by a badge. Honor isn't proven by a uniform. And dignity, once seen, can never be unseen again.